on how to use finance to build a more sustainable and equitable society. My name's Gillian Tett. I'm with the Financial Times. I'm also co-founder of a platform called Moral Money at the Financial Times, which is exploring exactly these issues. And we launched it about a year ago because what we're seeing is growing interest from the readers of the FT who are working in finance and business in looking at precisely this question, which is how do we actually harness finance to promote social goals and environmental goals, and frankly, make the world we live in better or less worse. So we have a terrific group of people to talk about that this morning. We have Jay Collins, who's from Citi, who's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown looking at sustainability. Andrea Jung, who is CEO of Grameen, who was formerly well known as CEO of Avon, and Rich Lesser from BCG, the consulting group, who I presume is getting a lot of questions from your clients these days on this very topic. So different perspectives, different backgrounds, but basically united with a similar goal, which is to how to bring together parts of the world that we never used to put together, which is banking, finance, business, sustainability, green issues, and consultancy. So, Rich, tell us about how the world is changing from your perspective in terms of what your clients want to know about these days, and whether you are indeed getting a lot of people asking about this, and perhaps most importantly, whether COVID has helped that conversation or not.
Well, thank you, Gillian. It's a pleasure to be here. It's such an important set of topics. I would say from our observations, this has become one of the main topics that clients are wrestling with right now, which is how to engage in a world in a multi-stakeholder mindset and still with a mindset around shareholder value creation and delivering what their owners and shareholders expect of them. And that the world we're living in right now has become so complex and so dynamic that those questions are frequently brought on the stage from different angles, from a climate angle, from a financial inclusion, from a racial equity and justice angle, and now, of course, in responding to a pandemic and keeping people safe and how to address that. We had argued actually now a number of years ago that the two weren't in conflict with each other, that total societal impact and total shareholder value creation were not two things where there was a seesaw, you chose one or the other, but that rather it was the combination of the two that maximized value creation, both for shareholders and in the world. And I think right now that belief, which has been reinforced by work Citi did, I know Jay is on this, I think he can speak to that, and other leading banks and investment banks have done over the years, have reinforced that message. So we see it as a top of mind issue. I think the challenge of COVID, to the second part of your question, is creating a near-term challenge and a huge challenge for many companies to navigate. But actually what we're hearing from consumers is, if anything, this has reinforced their understanding that these bigger issues can affect their lives in direct ways. I think it's put more emphasis from a consumer standpoint on climate. And of course, we've had other issues, certainly at the US end in recent months, that have heightened focus on equity, inclusion, and other topics. So companies are forced to deal with it. Many of them want to deal with it, but how to deal with it is still extremely challenging. Pressures have gone up, not down.
But Rich, I'm kind of curious before I turn to Jay. I mean, companies, as you say, are facing so many pressures right now. Isn't worrying about ESG just a kind of distraction they can't afford, frankly? They're trying to survive.
So let me give my own answer to that first, and then how do I think some of them think about it? My own answer to that is that's exactly the wrong way to think about it. That in fact, companies that have performed well on ESG measures, on average, whether you look at it from avoiding tail risks on the downside end or creating more value on the upside end, that companies that have performed well on ESG measures have tended to outperform on shareholder value creation. So the fact that there's more pressure right now, of course, management time has to focus on some of the near-in things over the coming months, but it should not take away. If anything, it should reinforce that getting to a balanced view of how to create value across stakeholders, not because it creates more long-term shareholder value, not to replace long-term shareholder value creation. I would argue the data not just because we want it to be right, but the data from many angles reinforces that. From clients and from companies, I'd say there's a range of views. Some of them get that totally, have been living it long before COVID. Some of them have stepped up more recently. For some of them, it's the way you've described it. I think some still feel like they've got so many short-term pressures, it's harder. But I've heard like airlines are about the most pressured industry we can imagine right now. I've heard airline execs in private settings, not to the public, speaking passionately about how they'll come out of this with more focus on how they reduce their environmental footprint, how they move to technologies wherever they can to make things better. I mean, this is an industry that's under massive strain. So I don't think it's just that, you know, when things are good, in good times, you think about this, and in bad times, you know, you forget about it.
That's fascinating. Well, Jay, I should say, by the way, we're already getting some questions here. Anyone who wants to ask a question who's watching, do please send in a question through the question or chat function, and we'll try and pick them up and incorporate them into the conversation, because it actually makes for a much richer and more dynamic dialogue to know that an audience is listening and want to chuck in their questions. So please do send them in. I'll start bringing them through pretty fast. But Jay, you work for a sector, finance, which has not traditionally been seen as being on the side of the angels. After 2008, quite the contrary. Why are you getting involved in sustainability? And what does that mean in practice for a group like Citi?
Okay, so let me start with the why, and then I'll talk about the practice. The why is you know, it is the imperative of our age. It is core to who we are. It is core to what's happening in the world. If we don't act in the next decade, instead of facing virtual cycles of opportunity, we will have vicious cycles of some pretty serious and devastating consequences for everyone on the planet. So climate change is real. It's scientific based, and you know, I would put this in the context of the convergence of COVID and the social factors with the climate change issues and challenges that we're facing. They are converging, and you're seeing it across our stakeholders. All of our stakeholders, from our employees to our shareholders, citizens, consumers, you know, from the Gen Zs and the millennials on up, these issues have become mainstream. And it's odd that it took COVID. I don't know, if, Gillian, if you've read Michelle Walker's book on the gray rhino, but you know, we stared at the pandemic knowing it was coming. Scientists told us, politicians told us, and we stared at that gray rhino, and it, you know, and we did nothing virtually. And it's taken this wake-up call to say, hey, you know, the social issues, kind of like methane below the permafrost, have been boiling up, and they're now real. To also say at the same time, we can't do that again. I mean, we can't face a kind of a Carney tragedy of commons where we just look at that as so far out we won't do anything. Now is the time to act. And so we believe that. And we've taken issues like this out of the CSR team and the foundation and put it into the boardroom and the management team, whether it's diversity, inequality issues, or climate change. And so practically speaking, let me just give one example, and then we can have more dialogue, Gillian. But you know, we had what we thought then were fairly ambitious climate financing objectives in the past. We've now announced a $250 billion 5-year plan. That's 50 billion a year versus 10 billion in the past plan. In fact, it's 2.5 times bigger in half the time. And it's really about driving just transition, because this is ultimately a transition, whether it's social transition or climate change. It's going to be funded. So we've got to redirect capital. Now, granted, we didn't start this without saying, let's get our own house in order. Like, first of all, let's call a spade a spade. We don't have gender right yet. We're working on it. We put metrics around it. Inequality, race inequality, let's measure it. Let's make progress, and climate change as well. Well, we've been ambitious in the financing. Corbat, our CEO, has called a spade in terms of our loan book and the need to move forward. So this is a transition for us. Let's get our own house in order, set real metrics that are measured and delivered over time. And then let's work with our suppliers and let's work with our clients. And this is not just in our boardroom, it's in every client's boardroom right now. And we believe that capital and the redirection of capital can help.
So did you face any sort of internal skepticism or hostility inside Citigroup when you started doing this?
You know, when we started the Sustainable Finance Committee internally, we had junior bankers come out of the woodworks to volunteer to say, give me a night job, give me a weekend job, how can I help? The employee reaction to understand this better, to learn, to participate, to think of sustainability really, Gillian, as a horizontal across every vertical of the firm, whether it's a product area, whether it's an industry coverage group, across any client or product segment of the bank. The interest in being a part of this is real. And if you think what the message of COVID has done is it's shown that individual behavior is collective behavior, right? If you don't wear your mask and you don't wash your hands, it affects all of us. And so there is this sense that responsible behavior and an understanding, embracing of that is part of our culture, and people want to participate. And so, yes, are there business challenges? The energy business, of course, we will be working to transition the fossil fuel business over time with the clients. That's not going to be easy. No one's calling it easy. But we look at what we just saw with BP, the other day and the stock rallies, and we realize that this isn't just non-shareholder stakeholders, that actually the market is reacting to this stuff. You perform badly in terms of how you treat your employees during COVID, and your ESG score gets hit and you feel it. So this is now core, Gillian.
Well, fascinating. Well, I'm going to come back and pick up on some of those topics with both you and Rich in a moment, but I'd like to bring in Andrea, because you come from a very different sector. You forged this incredible career, became a beacon for many female entrepreneurs in Avon, and then you went across to Grameen. Why did you move to Grameen? What are you doing there? And how does this fit into this conversation?
Yeah, well, great to be with everybody. So I moved from Avon to Grameen almost 7 years ago. And while on the one hand, they seem maybe perhaps very different, one a public company and the other, an NGO, nonprofit microfinance organization, the missions are actually very similar in that giving women entrepreneurs, particularly in Grameen's case, it's 99% minority-owned, Black and brown, female-headed businesses. The opportunity to get access to capital is critical. It's been an extraordinary journey. The organization has given out over $1.6 billion in loan capital to over 130,000 low-income women entrepreneurs in the United States in 15 cities. And some remarkable statistics, because these are non-recourse loans, are that these are 99+% repaid loans. We've been able to build credit scores and promote asset building for all of these entrepreneurs. It's been an extraordinarily heartbreaking and inspiring year in 2020. Obviously, we all know the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on low-income families, communities, and small business owners. And, Grameen has been no exception. We've seen that. We had over 25% of our members who were either themselves affected or someone close to them. 40% were staring down food insecurity, and 85% of them told us, we do a weekly pulse survey, that their businesses were, they had concerns about even just kind of seeing it over to the other side. On the inspirational side, we were able to really continue to pivot the model to 100% virtual. And we're able to stand down. We've given out almost $100 million of loan capital, 30,000 loans to, again, low-income, minority-owned businesses since April 1st during the pandemic. And believe it or not, 99+% of that has been being repaid, very consistently every week. And I think it's just testament to the resilience, the need for the capital, what I would say is my experience at Grameen, and why I think, hopefully, I'm sure this is going to be part of our collective conversation, is, this is, it's never waste a good crisis. I mean, I think, unfortunately, what we've learned is that the issue of financial inclusion, systemic racism in financial products that get down to the core target market we're talking about is critical. I mean, there's no recovery in the country or the world without it being a just and inclusive recovery, not just because it's the right thing to do, but just mathematically, we're talking about the number of businesses that need the help. When you look at women-owned businesses, when you look at the minority businesses, whether it was how much PPP money they received as a part of the total stimulus or prior to the pandemic, just the system of making sure that access to capital is there. We've got to build back the system. And I think I'm optimistic because partners, whether it's consulting partners that we've had like BCG or corporations, financial institutions like Citi, and I'm not just mentioning the two because I'm sharing this panel with these two great leaders, but because it's a collective effort. As a CDFI, we need that kind of help. But I think this is a moment where people are really realizing we've got to change the system, that without financial inclusion, there is no recovery, no just recovery.
Well, I think the point you make about the PPP loans and the very unequal distribution of those indicates the point about the biases within the financial system. I'm just curious, so who backs Grameen? Where do you get your money from that's now being used to go out to this wider community?
Yeah, we have the fortune of having a tremendous amount of philanthropic support. We have philanthropic support from financial institutions and corporations. We've got individuals and private foundations that support us. And we also are able to tap into friendly patient capital and debt. So we raise about a third of our capital from philanthropy. 2/3 of what we raise externally is from senior debt and subordinated social impact vehicles, which are extremely important to us in terms of fueling the portfolio. And I think one thing that's been interesting for us is that because we are a social business, if you would, all of our existing portfolio and branches get to sustainability. So we self-fund through our own interest income after about 4 years. So the capital is used to expand, and that's why I think we've gotten to such scale.
Right.
The average financial branch of Grameen, I'll use an example. The first one that we opened in Jackson Heights in Queens is earning almost $2 million of income itself. So it funds itself. We're a nonprofit, so it just funds further expansion for more needy entrepreneurs and more cities.
Wow, amazing.
So sustainable model.
It would be amazing in a time of ultra low interest rates. So yeah, that's very striking. And I think your default rates, or your repayment rates, are startling compared to what else is happening. As Jay knows, the rest of the country doesn't necessarily have that level of low level of defaults right now. But I'm curious, Jay, I mean, something like Grameen, it's self-evident what is good business or what is sustainable business, how it's promoting it. But for a group like Citi, how do you measure what is or is not sustainable?
So that's a fantastic question. Again, if you look across the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals that cut across pretty much every social challenge of our time, it's no easy task to measure yourself against all of them. So, what we tell our clients and what we started with is just beginning to take one after another and put metrics around that. Jane Fraser, our new CEO, did that in the gender space, where we just drove gender into the business and put metrics against them. There, as I said before on climate, first you start at home, which is getting your own house in order, measuring what you do. What is your footprint? How are you helping with financial inclusion? How are you responding to COVID? So, in our case, we made a decision to take the SBA's PPP program and donate the profits from that business back to small businesses, to minority businesses. We believe that building back better is fundamentally building back small and addressing some of the inequalities in the process. So it does require putting a sustainability lens on. It's almost a prism that has to start to affect your day-to-day mindset, with a belief that we are in a multi-stakeholder world where this is good business. I mean, good responsible behavior now is not at the price of, or it's not a cost that one can look at as a hit to business. It is actually essential to maintain, grow, and build the business. But as you implied, data is everything. I mean, Mike Corbat talks all the time about just, you are what you measure. You just can't perform against something that you can't measure. So the clearer we get metrics around this, the better. And one, I see Rich nodding, but one metrics, for example, Gillian, that we think is rather new and important is just that this $30 trillion worth of investors in the world that are now benchmarking themselves, factoring in to sustainability, they want outcomes. In fact, they're demanding outcomes. They want additionality. They want to see what you're doing. Not that use of proceed bonds won't continue to be important, but most importantly, these investors are going to ask capital market participants for metrics. So give us a stretch goal, give us a SASB metrics that you think you can achieve, and we will reward that. So new products and solutions that actually reward good behavior, that drive our 250 million as we redirect capital toward things that have real outcomes that can be measured. We believe that investors are going to reward that. In fact, in the new normal, in the new paradigm, investors are going to punish those that don't behave that way.
So I actually was just, those of you who haven't yet signed up to the Moral Money platform at the Financial Times, you should, because in fact, we have a big discussion about that this morning. The World Economic Forum has worked with the big four accounting firms to create what appears to be the first coordinated set of ESG metrics. It's currently a really messy, mucky alphabet soup of different systems and a lot of acronyms. But Rich, do you have much hope that we're going to get much clarity from the metrics anytime soon? Are you hearing your clients complain about just how messy and murky this current alphabet soup is?
Oh, yes, they're complaining. Sorry. Oh, okay, I'm unmuted now. Yes and yes is the answer to your two questions. Yes, they find the current alphabet soup to be very murky and difficult to navigate. And I think that it is very difficult. At one point, someone counted like 600 different measures if you took all the different organizations and everything they had suggested. But yes, I am optimistic that we can make real progress here. And you alluded to something that I was going to mention. The International Business Council within the WEF that Brian Moynihan chairs. Brian, I think, really took it upon himself in that role to ask the four accounting firms, the four leading accounting firms, to take on this alphabet soup, you called it, of measures and consolidate it down to a much shorter list that is not intended to be comprehensive. By definition, it can't be, but it can be a foundation for many companies to be able to use with more consistency and hopefully over time, more of a recognition that companies that do use that framework are fulfilling their responsibilities around transparency. Of course, in individual sectors, there will be some other things to add. It doesn't mean it's necessarily totally comprehensive, but we've had now 3 discussions on this over a year, including one a month ago. And I think that there's alignment that they're really onto something very good. And I think the 4 accounting firms, I think, did a nice job of trying to help narrow it down. The last meeting, I believe, they were at 21 measures. So 21 is still a lot, but 21 is not 600. And you can start to work with that. And maybe every company doesn't do all 21 right to start. But if you can start to get a foundation and leverage the great work done by SASB and TCFD and others and try to bring that in, I think we can make progress. It's not an overnight solve. It's not an overnight solve because we'll learn as we go how these metrics play. And there's a lot of foundational underpinning that needs to be put both inside companies to be able to report effectively and inside society to be able to interpret it. And because in different sectors, as I said, there'll be other things that are needed. But if we can get started more consistently, some people do it already on this journey, it's a big
Well, I'm
step
told
forward.
that, at least for the accounting industry, it's a bit like a kumbaya moment, because you never get the heads of the big four all sitting together on the same panel at the same time. And they appear to be trying to do that right now. So that's kind of progress. Yeah. But we're getting some really great questions coming through. So I'm going to start actually going to the questions straight away. Some of them are for Andrea, some are from Jay. But I'd like to ask perhaps one to Andrea first. Specifically, as it relates to people in urban areas and the lower end of the employment spectrum, i.e. barriers to employment with little or no marketable skills or education, how can the financial community impact that community? I mean, what would you like to see, Andrea, aside from lots more support for Grameen?
Well, I think it's not just Grameen, but I mean, entrepreneurship is, people being able to earn an additional income or substituted income while they are in fact looking for work is something that we're seeing every single day. We measure obviously not just self-employment and sole proprietors, but how many jobs are created through small businesses. And I think, we all know that the number is huge. If you just had every small business, I think one out of three small businesses hire a couple of employees, you mathematically begin to really make a big dent in unemployment. And then a lot of these jobs are in urban low-income areas, in the neighborhoods where, it's that Main Street thought. So I do think getting capital out to small businesses, we've all talked about it, the disproportionate impact for small businesses post-COVID-19. I think it is a huge opportunity to create jobs because, and again, in addition to running your own business, there's a lot of employment, adding 1, 2, 3, even 6. We have on average probably less than 10 employees for a lot of our businesses, but those employees are critical when you talk about scale.
So one of the things I'm curious about before I turn to Jay is Grameen was actually first created in Bangladesh, I believe, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting to see a model that's been working in the developing world brought back to America through reverse innovation. Can you say something about that? I mean, should we be looking in this new globally interconnected world to more of these kind of reverse innovation projects or initiatives?
I think the answer is absolutely yes. I think it's sort of fascinating that from what was then almost the poorest country on earth that was able to really reach its millennium goal in terms of having the rate of poverty 3 years earlier than its commitment to the UN and Bangladesh, very much due not just to Grameen, but to microfinance and microcredit. We're seeing the very same thing apply when people were sort of skeptical that it would be applicable in the first world and, and as rich, quote, a nation as the United States. But the issue of income inequality is huge. But I think all these issues, just even flipping over to climate change and sustainability, I think there's such an interconnectedness. While we're focusing on this alphabet soup and all of the metrics and measures, on the ground, what I think we've learned from some of the issues in the poorest countries, whether it is impact from floods, is that unless you have healthy people and a healthy planet, you won't have a healthy economy, that there's a disproportionate impact to those that are poor and underserved on any impact from climate change. We saw it in Houston with the hurricanes, in San Juan, Puerto Rico. We're seeing it, I'm sure, from all the fires in California, that those who will be the most impacted and have the toughest time recovering will be, those who don't have the financial inclusion. So these issues that we're talking about on the ground are very connected. And that is something I think we can learn from the developing world. On a reverse.
I must say that from my point of view, from my point of view, I must say that, I think COVID has shown two things. First of all, we're interlinked in a chain of humanity, and when the weakest link breaks in that chain, we all suffer. And secondly,
it breaks everywhere. I think, to your point, it breaks on all sides.
It breaks everywhere. Yeah. But also, as you say, the West doesn't have a monopoly on good ideas. If you look at the countries that have done well through COVID, actually, it's not been the countries which like to think that they are exceptional or filled with exceptionalism and have all the answers for the world in the West. So it's been quite striking in that respect. But Jay, I have a question for you. From someone who's watching, it says, I am certified in D&I, diversity and inclusion. And one of the issues when you discuss these challenges are, quote, what are the metrics to show improvement? Is it just number of employees or something more nuanced, like how does it drive ROI? And I'd be curious to ask Rich that as well after Jay.
Right. First, great. So first, let me just say on your previous comment, Gillian, and question to Rich on the metrics. As you know, the Global Investors for Sustainable Development did a report recently that said exactly that we have this cacophony of information and data and poor disclosures and poor transparency. And so I just applaud the effort of the big four, others now, but it is so systemic that at the end of the day, we don't need new standards. We need conformed, transparent, aligned, comparable standards. And without it, none of us can measure. And so that's going to be important, not just for climate change, but for measuring the broad base of sustainable development, including all of the goals. So let me just turn to that question. I think first is, yes, it is nuanced, and yes, you do have to drill down. One of the things when we look at minority employment, for example, or gender, you can't just look at your hiring policy. Quite frankly, because over time you can have attrition, and the attrition ends up meaning that you don't have the same mix and in the trenches of the company as you did with just the hiring policy. The board at the top is a reflection of who you are and its leadership from the top down. But my point is it's multi-factor, it's multi-layers, and you really have to look at multiple standards. And so if you looked at Citi in terms of these, there's multiple measurements. We're not relying on any one individual factor. And second, it requires cultural change. It's not the HR department. It's not just the managing directors in the firm. It requires a cultural shift that says this is who we are and this is who we want to be. And that's something that you've seen. And there's an expression in Spanish, no hay mal de que por bien no venga. There's nothing bad out of which something good doesn't come. But it's just so extraordinary that COVID is producing a need for and a desire for social metrics. And what's happened with inequality in the United States, it is producing real deep dive looks at how do we think about this. And as a bank that's driven off of metrics, they get very specific for every SDG, and they get specific across departments. And also, quite frankly, I think, if you'd have been a fly on the wall listening to us talk about the 250 billion and 5-year objective, that is no small number. And that's a lot of capital. And that's us crowding that in, which can change multiples of that. You have to have some accountability around that, right? That just doesn't happen in 5 years without pushing that down and saying, okay, who owns this and how much of it comes from where, and are the people that participate in that going to own that? And so there are performance metrics across that and the social that must be driven by us and our clients into the business.
Fascinating. Rich, how do you see this developing right now in terms of, how do you measure D&I? You must get a lot of your clients saying, yikes, what do we do? We've got Black Lives Matter protests happening outside. Some of our younger employees are furious with the senior management. What do you tell companies to do about this?
So can I just start with why it's worth doing beyond being the right thing to do, which is in and of itself enough basis, but that was part of the question that I think had come in. We've done so much research, but others have too. It's not just us, that organizations that are more diverse are more innovative, more creative, less likely to fall into status quo thinking, more likely to spot tail risks and other risks earlier in their business because they create more open dialogue. That means not just having diversity in terms of backgrounds and experiences and ethnicities, it means being inclusive so that people can be their authentic selves, speak what they really feel, and not feel like they're just, conforming to a very narrow culture. But I do want to highlight first that there are real business benefits here, particularly in a world where there's more uncertainty, heightened degrees of risk, more rapid change, more need for innovation. I mean, that's the world we're all living in. So those elements would have been important in any time period, but they are disproportionately important in the time period that we're living in right now and will be in the decade ahead. Then to come back to the question that you framed, I just want to pick up on something that Jay said. Of course, it is very important to look at hiring and to try to be diverse in hiring and to try to mirror the populations that your company is based in. Global footprints mean that it's not the same in every place. And to recognize that in many cases, that means thinking differently about the traditional pools that you hire from. It means thinking differently about cultivating relationships with different populations than you may have in the past, and going out of your way to show commitment to not just hiring people, but to giving them opportunity once they're there. Hiring is the starting point, but when you measure the return on diversity investment, you often find companies are spending their money in diversity, not necessarily in the places that would generate the highest return. And like any business investment, this warrants investment, but it should be targeted in the best ways. And efforts for the people that are already at the company to make sure that it is truly inclusive, to make sure that you are having real conversation about what is getting in the way, whether it's unconscious bias or behaviors which leave some people feeling uncomfortable that other people are not sensitive to, which particularly happens around racial relationships, but can happen in gender, in our LGBT communities as well, and really looking deeply at attrition statistics to understand, are we creating an environment not just where people come, but where they want to stay and they feel like if they stay, there'll be opportunities to advance in a reasonable way and to build their careers. We find companies are often over-investing on the hiring side, and I'm not minimizing the importance of hiring, but under-investing on what they do to make it work for the people who are there, which then has a flowback to make it harder to do the hiring. Then you have to work harder on the hiring because people aren't sure why they should come. So then you have to do a lot more. So you can get into sort of a vicious cycle around that. And then I think there's a leadership ranks conversation as well. Then by leadership, I mean everything up sort of upper middle management through to the board. That's only like 5 layers in a company. That depending on your starting point, depending on mix, it's so important to make sure that there's slating that is giving multiple people an opportunity, that there's a long-term look at talent pipeline so that you're investing in people early and building it for generations to come. That, as Jay said, board diversity really does reflect diversity to both encourage better thinking in the board. Diversity helps boards be better too, but also just mirrors to some degree, at least, the societies in which we operate. I mean, those are the kinds of things that we often end up spending quite a lot of time on. But the important thing is that for current leadership, they're not just doing it as a response to people telling them they're really bad, which is fine, but it tends to be more of a short-term reaction, and it's more seeing the benefits that will come in a stronger, more vibrant, more innovative, more value-creating business that come from building diversity. Once people get that, then it becomes an investment like many other business priorities. It's so much easier to invest behind it and sustain investments over long periods of time.
And if I can just say, Julian, it's reinforced Rich. It's fundamentally, if culturally you believe that diversity outperforms, then the rest follows at all levels. It's just a cultural belief in that. And you put metrics around it, that will put us on this just pathway that we need to be on.
Right. Different question. Expanding from an earlier question, Jay, how exactly are financial institutions penalized for not working lower income minority owned businesses?
Okay, that's a very specific question. First of all, I'm not sure that there is a direct penalization in an old school kind of regulatory sense of the word. I would definitely say that more and more communities are at the heart of financial services, and if you don't understand that and you don't address the needs of communities, then you will stop serving them because they will stop coming to you. And so let's just talk about financial inclusion for a second. I mean, first of all, there has to be that desire to drive financial inclusion services to the lowest end of the pyramid. And interestingly, COVID is making it easier because the world is going digital faster. Everything is, tech is tech and telecom related. So, whether it's ed tech, health tech, fintech, development tech, the technologies now are connecting the last mile, and the potentialities of what that means for the 1.7 billion people on the planet that are that don't have a bank account, that have been left out of the financial system, that need to be included, means that there are ways now that banks can connect to those individuals and push financial services down and better. If you look as one concrete example of what we're doing in Mexico with QR codes and the ability for benefits to be distributed to the poorest people for free through innovations in technology. Those are the kinds of things that are a requirement of our time from the digital and tech disruption side, from the fintech side, and the financial inclusion imperative. And I would say these collaborative models now across everything, but in financial inclusion, we're seeing it as well. There is a new era of collaboration, of public-private partnership to try and solve these problems. Central banks that have a remit now to get at financial inclusion that will work with banks like ours and fintech players to collaborate together in a sandbox to solve these problems. So it's coming. It may not be fast enough, but over time, sustainable behavior will be rewarded or punished, not just by shareholders, but by your customers. And particularly as we're seeing now, you just have to talk to your kids, right? Or I talk to my students, that it's different because they're real time asking the tough questions of what are you doing? And what are you doing today? And how do you behave, not just in your personal life, but in your professional workplace?
Andrea, do you expect that your borrowers will eventually graduate from you to a bank?
Absolutely. I mean,
because of course it's tended to be fintech that has more penetration amongst the minority communities, which of course is one reason why they lost out on the PPP loans.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see ourselves at the very beginning of the path to financial inclusion. So our members come to us when they've been sort of financially excluded, unable to get a loan because they have no credit or poor credit, and they've been rejected, if you would, from the financial system. And it's interesting because Grameen started in 2008 in the United States, which a lot of people were like, "Why would you start a lending program to low-income, poor credit women in the middle of the biggest pullback on lending?" Certainly didn't have the health aspect, but that was our last major global, financial crisis in 08, 09. And I think what we found, our loan average is really small. It's amazingly small. It is life-changing, but it's small. So our average loan is about $4,000, and our largest loans are still less than $20,000. And so there is a big gap. and being able to graduate our members to larger loans when they require them is a real opportunity. One of the things that we want is our members to be banked. And we are not an FDIC, savings institution. So we have a lot of partnerships, primarily with Citi, actually, to be able to give our members concessionary first-time bank accounts so they can begin saving. We know that if just before they get bigger loans, if they have asset building for a family that has $800 differential from those who don't, has a 7 times likelihood that their kids will go on to ongoing, university and education. So we want everybody to learn how to save, whether it's $5 a week and establish some kind of savings account that moves to checking, business checking, and further get them banked. Our goal is to get the unbanked banked with formal banking institutions and give them that pathway to inclusion with the formal.
I'd love to come and see it sometime, but what is a kind of business that actually would have a $4,000 loan? I mean, are we talking, because I know what happens in Bangladesh, but I'm just curious, for the benefit of anyone watching, what kind of things do you actually fund?
So we have about 50% of our businesses are in the service economy and 50% in the product economy, but we have small food establishments, and they can start off catering from their home, move to a food truck, and then end up being a restaurant that has 12 employees. I mean, that's the pathway in the food service business. We have a lot of salon businesses, hugely hit during COVID-19, where we have people who start off renting a chair, perhaps in a salon, and then owning a salon eventually with 3-4 employees, and obviously nail, hair services, things like that, which were shut down completely in March, and then started in phase 1 and phase 2, phase 3 reopening by Citi. We're seeing those businesses starting to come back, but quite a few of our members operate those cleaning services, lawn services. I mean, it really covers the gamut, but an average of $4,000 can significantly help in working capital, et cetera. A lot of the stuff that we're doing now they're replacing their inventory. They had to destroy their inventory and their working capital because they were forced to shut down. They've got to now replace that, and they've got to buy PPE as part of their operating expense, which they didn't have before, masks, plexi, et cetera. So those are the kinds of usage of the loans that we get. Many of them have some product businesses. They're selling products. I have a wonderful entrepreneur in Queens who is the primary tire shop, and so she's selling tires to first-line workers, firemen, policemen, as well as Uber drivers and taxis. And she's got a burgeoning business with many employees. Someone who was able to participate and finally get a PPP loan, et cetera. But these are the kinds of businesses that they run. That's
fascinating. It's the kind of businesses that, frankly, most people watching depend on completely without realizing how much they depend on it, but also are, as you say, not just excluded, but in many ways one of the pathways towards the American dream. So
I think the one thing that's misunderstood is, how much capital or how little capital it can take to actually save a business and save a life. I mean, again, $4,000 is a tremendous amount of money. And when we were helping some of our members get PPP loans, Rich, actually, you had a huge staff at BCG that was volunteering to help us walk our members through to an SBA loan. They, $16,000 loan, forgivable loan from the SBA Life Saving. There's lots of talks about some much larger numbers, but it is an extraordinary opportunity for some of these small businesses to just even get that kind of capital. Makes or breaks whether they can stay in business.
And Rich, just before I actually turn to the next question, I'm curious. So during COVID, if you say, okay, so I want to try and support Grameen, did you manage to? Did your employees volunteer for that? Did you round them up? Do they enjoy doing that kind of thing? How did that work? Because again, it's not the kind of thing you normally become a flashy, high-paid consultant to do. Is to help save a tire shop.
I think both. What's interesting, we put a huge amount into social impact every year in economic development, health, education, a whole range of topics all around the world. But this year, our social impact spending grew, I think, 40% so far this year versus last year. So we really used the moment of the crisis to say, We have so much capability to make a positive difference. We have an organization filled with people, young and old, but we're disproportionately a very young place that really want to be off in the world contributing and to really ratchet up our social impact investments quite dramatically this year in COVID-related stuff, in climate topics, more recently in racial equity and justice topics, as well as our traditional portfolio. And then second, exactly to your point, we also try to use our access to great social impact organizations and leaders like Andrea to say, where do people who want to volunteer their time put it to make a really big difference? And I'm always amazed because our jobs are intense, and so you don't think people have so much free time, but how much people want to volunteer to contribute in different organizations. And so I think we end up with a fair amount of both. And I'd say it's one of the things our staff finds most energizing is, young people today, I think BCGers, but not just, want to feel like their work has meaning and has impact and is contributing to addressing these huge challenges they see in the world. So we find it's the right thing to do for all of us, regardless of how many decades we've been at BCG or how many months. But it's particularly motivating, I think, to a generation of people coming into the work world and wondering if there'll be meaning in what they do.
Right. Well, we have a lot of great questions, so I'm going to start bouncing through them as fast as I can. What are the panelists' thoughts on the responsibility of public incentives to drive private sector sustainability and ESG alignment? As an ESG growth advisor, I see champions of change, but the majority of large organizations will not change until there are potentially financial incentives or external pressures to shift. Long-winded way of saying, do we need government to crack down?
Can I take this one just first?
Yeah.
We need a role for government. And it's not because businesses are badly intended or business leaders don't care. I don't feel that at all. I feel like they care a lot, but everybody responds to context. All of us, business leaders, doctors, teachers, everybody responds to the context of the world they're in and the expectations and pressures that come with it. And so I'm not for high degrees of regulation. I'm not for overwhelming people in bureaucracy or whatever, but we do need government to set some frameworks of what it's expecting and to have some rules around it if we're going to make progress at the speed we need to make it. To me, a lot of this is a speed question. I believe the direction of travel for business is a positive one, and I see that in many, many dimensions of how organizations have rethought their purpose, rethought ESG, reporting more broadly. I really believe business is going the right direction, but the pressures on the world right now are enormous. Climate first and foremost, where we're on paths to, changes that we will not be able to turn around, but also social pressures that we see in inequality and in injustice that still exists. And so I think that the frameworks that are set should be as light touch as possible, intended to set goals and intent, not intended to tell people the exact paths to go down or specify every single element. But I think that particularly if I look at climate, business will get reasonably far on its own. It would be so much easier if government would help establish a price on carbon, help do things like set rules around methane leaks, which it had and then released. There are just certain things that I think will make it easier to go further. The challenge, of course, is you can go too far and then you stifle growth and business and opportunity. So it is not a one direction of travel is always better, but we do need a balance.
Of course.
Gillian, can I just jump in there and add, I completely agree with Rich, but I just want to give you a pragmatic lens from my own point on, for instance, women on boards. So I have been, on boards for many years, and I would have been in the camp that said we want a very light touch, if any, of government having a point of view on this. But having sat on a European board in Germany and sitting on several US boards in my career, it was just fascinating. I was on the Daimler board at the time when certainly this issue of 30% women in the EU, but particularly when again, the legislation hadn't even happened, but Angela Merkel felt very strongly that was coming down the pike. I just would use Rich's, it accelerated. It wasn't that we weren't going there, but it accelerated probably by, I say, 5 years to a decade. And not just extraordinary women on the board, but in management as well. And here's a country that is saying, only 9% of engineering students are, women are graduating as engineering students. How can we mathematically get there? And then all of a sudden, lo and behold, you end up with not just women, but really qualified women engineers rising to the ranks because there is a lens on it, and that government is involved in promoting women at the top of companies and on boards. So if you go all the way to whether it's the legislation that's in California right now on women coming up at the end of 2021, as well as a just representation from a minority point of view, while on one hand, we shouldn't have to have been at this point, when you look at the speed, glacial, I would say, I have to say glacial speed. And if this can help accelerate it, I don't think this is a fad. I think we're ready for a systemic change. And I think we're going to see a very different lens on this, and rightly so, in the next 5 years.
Gillian, may I jump in on the same question? Yeah. So Cristina Figueres the other day was talking about, specific to getting ready for next year's COP process, surround sound for corporates from governments. And I love that concept, right? That governments, if they've got a surround sound of companies around the world, basically saying, we want this. This is what we're prepared to lead. This isn't just old school, you telling us what to do, but that actually there is a collaboration, as I said before, likened to that of World War II, where we come together and say what works and how do we get there, and what is a Paris-aligned path? What does net zero look like? What does the next 10 years between now and 2030, if we don't stay on that pathway, there are grave consequences. So we do need alignment with the regulators. We do, and we spend a lot of time with GISD and the UN process with the 30 alliance members of the Global Investors for Sustainability, talking to the Europeans on their green program. And what impresses me, Gillian, of that process is that they're listening, that we're talking, that there is actual real dialogue of what will it take to incentivize and appropriately disincentivize behavior along this transition. And governments are going to play a role. When you ask people about one of the biggest risks in the ESG space of what to expect, it's the lack of clarity around the regulatory framework. And unless we have clarity of where the regulators are going, such that people can stay in that general guide path or slope, we have confusion and cacophony again, and we don't need more of that. So aligning ourselves to governments and aligning that policy through collaborative and consultations like the EU is doing is going to be critical.
But one of the questions we have is pointing out that, of course, individual governments can't deal with most of these issues. It's going to require a lot of coordination from the United Nations and others. Do you think that the business community needs a much louder voice saying we need to support international groups like the United Nations, or anything that can actually rise above national governments? Is that something you think the business community needs to shout out for right now?
Yeah, so I think these collaborative mechanisms need a shout out, that we won't get there without public-private partnership, and that importantly, just transition in all of its ramifications, the future of work and the devastation that will happen to employees, the scale of investment in renewable energy and transition energy that has to happen such that the planet can continue to grow and economies grow and employ, it can't happen without this type of public-private partnership. Because if the EIBs of the world, if Werner Hoyer is not putting policy conditionality around Paris alignment for governments and putting policies in place that lend into just transition, the private sector can't follow. So we've got to work in tandem. And yes, there's got to be a sense that governments can collaborate in a way that moves fast enough, avoids some of the bureaucrats, doesn't overregulate, but that aligns us together in a way that the market can anticipate and invest in. So yeah, the UN, I think the GISD effort is an example of the kind of shout out where the Secretary General reached out to 30 CEOs and said, help tell us what we need to invest in sustainability.
Right. We're getting a lot of very specific questions, by the way, which are going to come through for Andrea and for Jay and for Rich. By the way, apparently this is the record number of questions you've had per session. So clearly you guys are ultra provocative and compelling that you're making the audience want to ask questions. Andrea, in this new paradigm, will gender shift from a politically correct topic to a strategic issue? If so, how?
I am optimistic. The answer is a resounding yes. I think we've moved past it's politically correct and on a gender basis. I think that the statistics were there well before COVID that, if women participated equally, whether it's equal pay, equal representation, equal participation in the workforce at senior levels, et cetera, that there would be trillions and trillions of dollars of global GDP created. I think Dar Kent said when he was CEO of Coca-Cola that the biggest emerging market in the world is women. And so that would say that just, again, the facts would say the case to be made for participation is there. It is not just the right thing to do, just to echo what Jay said, but it's just the right thing for the economy. I mean, there's just no resumption, growth, or recovery without that participation. And I believe that this is the moment that everybody understands that. When you look at, what is the percent of consumption being done by women on categories. I mean, when you look at any hard data facts, all things point to it's strategically important, not just the right thing to do. Of course, it's the right thing to do, and it's not just about equal rights and participation, but it is the strategically smart thing to do for every sector and every aspect of humanity.
Wow.
50% of the population making decisions at every level. And so we understand that where any decision is being made, just to quote Ruth Bader Ginsburg, women need to be present. I think people realize that.
So Rich, you
Could I just wanted to add, I really agree with Andrea. I think for so many organizations, I'm not saying everywhere, but many, what she described regarding women is correct. I think the question for the years ahead is, will that end up applying to other forms of diversity, race, the LGBT community, things like that, where I think right now for many companies, it's still more in the right thing to do camp. That doesn't mean they're not committed, but it's more because they believe it's the right thing to do. Then it's a strategic requirement. I mean, women are half the population. They have an unbelievable pool of talent as well as buying power. I think that's pretty broadly understood, not perfectly, but pretty broadly. I think that the question is whether we'll see companies evolve to seeing the same thing for diversity writ large across other populations. And I think there's been a big step forward this year in the awareness of how big the gaps are, how much work we need to do, how important it is to step up to the challenge. But we're probably still a few steps behind, if I were to be honest, on that journey than we are on the journey with regard to women.
Well, that leads to another great question, which is perhaps one for Jay. Financial services headhunters I have spoken with have relayed that, quote, diversity in hiring at the bulge bracket investment banks is typically putting non-Ivy League candidates on the slate. If there is true commitment at the C-suite level, how are the values of D&I hiring being cascaded down to the line managers who are doing the hiring, if at all?
Yes. So first is the diversity of the slate. Are we actually interviewing a diverse pool of candidates? Because if you're going to give equal opportunity to for any given position, it starts with ensuring that the candidates are diverse, and that's something that can't just come out of HR departments. That comes out of managers that are willing to ensure that the candidates are diverse. And just like I believe, everybody talks about Jane Fraser, our new CEO, being a woman, and I can assure you, if you know her as a leader, she wasn't picked because she was a woman. I mean, she is extraordinary in terms of her leadership. So but you've got to have the diverse candidates in the pool to select from, and that is an extra effort that comes with that belief that diversity outperforms, and to push that through the entire organization. So yes, to the answer to the question, does it have to be cascaded down to line managers? Absolutely. Does it have to become intrinsic to your culture? And then are people empowered to ask the tough questions, upward and downward, to say why, like what happened to this pool and this hire you made, and